Is there anyone out there that remembers the movie Minority Report? It's one of the few movies that I've ever seen in my whole life. Or maybe if you're younger and you like the Marvel fandom, you may remember the plotline from one of the best MCU movies, Captain America: Winter Soldier. In those movies, the moral question conundrum is asked: if algorithms or scientific consensus give us the impression that someone's biological makeup gives them the capacity to be extremely dangerous, should that person be punished before they commit the crime because of their makeup? Or is everyone responsible only for the choices that they actually act out in real life? It's a very interesting question and one that I have a very strong stance on, but I'm sure, like with most things in the world, people have strong opinions on both sides. There's a series that I've been interested in reading for a very long time, and that is the John Cleaver series by Dan Wells. You may recognize that name from the Writing Excuses podcast, which is like an award-winning podcast with a bunch of different authors, or you may recognize him from the podcast that he does with Brandon Sanderson called Intentionally Blank. Well, the first book in the John Cleaver series is called I Am Not a Serial Killer, and holy crap. I've heard mixed things about this series from my various friends, so I went in with sort of unsure expectations, but I was just completely blown away. I've been marathoning through these books and they are just, they're so good. But at the same time, I also understand why they may not be for everyone. Let's talk about the John Cleaver series, specifically book 1, I Am Not a Serial Killer. The setup for this book is that there is a main character. He has the red flags for many of the characteristics that generally are present in serial killers. And it doesn't help that the main character is also obsessed with serial killers, and he exhibits a lot of disturbing behavior while also working in his family's mortuary business, where he's constantly dealing with dead bodies, something that most people have strong aversion to for understandable reasons. It's in this situation that the protagonist of the series, John Cleaver, gets diagnosed with a rare but potentially dangerous mental illness that essentially says he is unable to feel empathy for other characters. And the story is told from the perspective of this main character, and you get to see all of his thoughts as he deals with this mental illness in living his everyday life with a broken family, and he lives in a small town through these struggles where eventually a serial killer rears its head, which is very interesting to the main character because he's been obsessed with serial killers for a very long time, and he also exhibits these tendencies that are present in serial killers, and the way that he deals with this is, it's just so fascinating. The book is not a very long read. The audiobook, I believe, is between 8 or 9 hours, so it's not a very long book, especially compared to a lot of the adult epic fantasy that I typically read. This book just is, it flies by because it's super interesting, but also it flies by because it's not that long. But wow, is there so much packed into this small book. And one of the things that I find most fascinating about it is the fact that we live in the head of this person who exhibits a lot of very abnormal behaviors and thought patterns due to his mental illness, and we have to sort of grapple with that as he deals with the situations that arise in his own life. And as the plot progresses, the main character has to deal with the evolution of his circumstances and the illness that he faces. And we spend a lot of time in his head. I think that there is a real possibility that this book may be too disturbing for many people. It's very dark, it's uncomfortable in extremely interesting and compelling ways, but also it is very uncomfortable for legitimate reasons. And because of that, I am loving this, but I also don't know if I could recommend it to everybody because there's a lot of trigger warnings that can happen. And also it may be hard to see through some of the more horrifying elements of what's happening to be able to understand or empathize with the mind of someone whose brain just doesn't work the same as everybody else's. And I think a lot of people are going to be faced with a very uncomfortable question, which is, how do we deal with people whose minds work differently than our own? And at what point should they be treated differently in society? Now, it's hard to tell exactly what time period that the early books in the series are based on. I believe that the first book was published in 2009. And even since 2009, I think we've made huge strides with how we approach and talk about different types of social differences, like people on the autistic spectrum, for instance. And I think it's super valuable and super helpful for us to know the different ways that people can process information and the different ways that people can understand relationships, or they may struggle with different elements of understanding relationships or social cues. And this book really does a deep dive into one of the most extreme versions of this, and you get to sort of experience it through the main character firsthand. And that is the main draw for me of this book, more so than just the plot. It's the characterization of the way that this character feels and the different feelings that you have towards the struggle that he's having, because sometimes it's really easy to root for this person, and sometimes you wonder if something should be done to prevent prevent this person from being able to exist in regular society. And that can be really difficult, because do you punish someone for something that they have the capability to do, or do you punish someone for the actions that they actually do? We have a lot of social norms that we accept in society, and these social norms exist for a reason. They allow us to know what is normal behavior and what is deviant behavior. What about people that don't have the ability to understand our social norms? How do we deal with that? How do we approach these relationships better to help understand them and help them understand other things better? Does the capacity or proclivity to do certain types of negative things naturally in society automatically justify some sort of precautionary measures for a certain type of person? If you just read some of the horror stories about serial killers on the internet, you can start to say, hey, if person A exhibits this type of behavior, they should be locked up. But what about if you actually could get into the mind of someone and try to see the world through their eyes? Is it possible that understanding where someone is coming from can better help you relate to them and make society a better place if you are more equipped to handle different situations with different types of people, with different types of social abilities? What is cultural? What is societal? What is acceptable? What is not? Is it different from different types of people with different types of backgrounds? These are some of the problems that we grapple with in this story that is also pretty breakneck in its pacing. There are times when you'll be rooting for characters. There are times when you will feel genuine, strong emotions, and it's like, how did this story that contains some of the elements that it does affect me so strongly in my emotional core? But then other times you will be reading stretches of what is going on in this person's head, or the ways that they react to certain types of negative stimuli, and you're like, wow, I am supremely uncomfortable in major ways. This is one of those books that I found out recently was marketed as a YA book. It's hard to know what that actually means, and I do have videos that talk about my thoughts on the YA marketing whatever trends, but I will say that primarily, except for this year when I've been reading a lot of YA and I didn't even realize it, but primarily I read mostly adult epic fantasy, and in most of the adult epic fantasy that I read, I have not experienced anything quite as uncomfortable as a lot of the moments in this presumably YA novel. And it's not because the content is overly explicit in a lot of ways. Like, in a lot of ways, the content isn't that explicit. It's kind of toned down. But in other ways, the content in this book is more disagreeable than a lot of the other books that I read that are technically rated higher or whatever. There are moments that are agonizing to read and gross on multiple levels, while also there are moments where you feel like heartbreak, moments where you feel joy. It's a wild ride, and it's a quick one. I couldn't put it down. Like, I've been reading slower in general lately, but not only have I not been able to put this book down, but I'm actually on book 3 already, and I just started it like last week, which I guess the way that I'm spacing these videos out, it's not necessarily going to line up for you, but like, I've read 2.5 of the books in a week. And so this is a scenario where I absolutely loved this first book. I do think that there are some parts that don't feel as well executed as the best parts of the book. There are some parts that I do feel are rushed. There's some plot points that I think happen so quickly that they do feel underdeveloped. And I'm the type of person that even when I enjoy a short book, there's often times where I wish we had spent more time with certain elements of a story. And that is the case here. Like I said, I think there are parts that are rushed or underdeveloped, but generally speaking, I think that this book asks super interesting questions. I think it's extremely compelling with its main character and the way that you get to experience the world through their eyes. I love a lot of the plot twists in this book. And yeah, it was such a page turner that I've just continued on with the series. Yeah, if the things that I've said do sound appealing to you, let me know in the comments down below. Have you read the John Cleaver series? Evidently, this is 6 books and a novella. I feel like in the fantasy communities that I generally take part in, this is not a super talked about series. And when I looked for other reviews of them, none of the major people that I normally watch on BookTube have talked about this series at all. And I think maybe it's a difficult one to recommend because of how rough parts of it can be. But for me, this was amazing, and I think it could spawn some really interesting discussions. I was completely blown away by the surprise that was I Am Not a Serial Killer by Dan Wells, and now as I'm progressing through the rest of this series, it's making me want to check out more of his work, because I think there are certain elements that as an author he's able to capture in just a magnificent way. And I'm sure that some of the stuff that I thought was not handled as well is something that he's probably been able to improve on over the rest of his writing career. I guess this was also turned into a movie, which I may end up watching at some point. I'm not sure. But yeah, let me know. Have you heard of this series by Dan Wells, the John Cleaver series? The first book is I'm Not a Serial Killer. If you have read it, what are your thoughts? Because when I looked at my friends' reviews on Goodreads, they really spanned the full gambit from like, I love this book to I couldn't handle this book. It was really, really disturbing. If you like this video, please smash that like button. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel to see more videos from me in the future, please do that. I'm already continuing along with the series, and so I will probably continue to talk about this series on the channel when I'm able to. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.
Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.